Let's talk about Raphael. So, for centuries, Raphael was recognized as the supreme high Renaissance painter. More so than Michelangelo, people thought he was more versatile and more prolific than Leonardo da Vinci. Raphael dies at the age of 37, but his work presents a classicism that dominates the academic tradition in European painting until about the 19th century. He was born in Urbino, where his dad, Giovanni Santi, was the court painter. And we know that he began his training there at the court, and that we know he saw works from Mantegna, Uccello, and Della Francesca. His earliest paintings were greatly influenced by Perugino. Perugino was his teacher, and from 1500 on, he became an independent master. In 1508, he works throughout central Italy, particularly in Florence, where he becomes a noted portraitist and painter of Madonnas. At the age of 25, Pope Julius II calls him to court to help with the redecoration of the papal apartments. We're going to look at those in just a few minutes. And in Rome, he evolves as a portraitist. He becomes one of the greatest of all of the history painters. He remains in Rome for the rest of his life, and in 1514, Bramante dies, and he is appointed architect in charge of St. Peter's Cathedral. This is Raphael's The Small Cowper Madonna. Raphael was a student of Perugino's. Perugino was someone that Raphael met in his home of Urbino. I know there's lots of rhyming words in that. The bottom line is Raphael eventually moves to Florence, where he sees the work of Michelangelo. He would have seen the work of Donatello there, and he would have been exposed to the pyramidal composition that tends to be so popular in the High Renaissance time. The other thing that is important about this work of art is that it is a good example of what disegno style looks like in the High Renaissance. Disegno style starts with drawing. The figure itself begins, or the painting itself begins with a figural drawing. Because it begins with a drawing, it seems as if the figures are more solid looking. They have more of a sculptural feel to them. If you look at when we get to the colore paintings, you'll be able to see the difference. But also, I want to point out to you the idealism in this particular painting versus the realism. So the pyramidal composition is obviously an idealistic composition. The baby's size is an idealistic size. A baby who's a small infant would not be that large. Raphael also highlights the human condition by emphasizing the baby's relationship to the mom. So this is Jesus being held by Mary. In that sense, this is an idealized work of art, but it also has realism because the people are biblical figures, but they're represented as realistic people. Jesus being the baby and Mary being Jesus's mom. So he emphasizes those human relationships, and that makes this a very realistic portrait. In the background, you see the Italian hallmark of the landscape. It's not as hazy and unrealistic as Leonardo da Vinci's landscape techniques. He really tries to make the landscape look as if it is in a real setting. And of course, you see the entire figure, much like we saw the Mona Lisa's upper torso, we get a sense of how large the entire figure is. The room that you're looking at is the room in the Vatican that was used by Pope Julius II as a library and a private office. It is the first work of art that Raphael was commissioned for from the Vatican. He was commissioned to create the frescoes that you see on the walls. The room itself is in the Stanza della Segnatura, which is part now of the Vatican Museum. So what you see here is a panned out version of the frescoes. The next slide will be a close-up version of one of the frescoes that he does. This is the School of Athens by Raphael. It is a close-up of the fresco from the room that we just looked at. Raphael creates an architectural space within the fresco that is reminiscent of classical antiquity. You can see the barrel vaults have a decorative honeycomb pattern on them. Those barrel vaults reflect something called a coffer. A coffer is a recessed indentation in the ceiling that helps to alleviate the weight of a dome. The barrel vault was something that was commonly used. It was invented in classical antiquity, and so in order to pay homage to the architectural developments of classical antiquity, Raphael chooses to create a room based on barrel vaulting. I said earlier that the barrel vault ceilings were decorated with coffers. That coffers usually are inside of a dome. They can also be inside of a barrel vault as a decorative element. On the right and the left in the background, you see two statues. Those statues are Athena and Apollo. And then the people that are gathered together are a meeting of the Western minds of philosophy. Some of them are from antiquity, some of them are from Raphael's day, but they all were people who were monumental in philosophical ideal sets in this time period. You see the two men in the center. That is Apollo. Oh, I'm sorry. That is Plato and Socrates. Plato points at the ceiling. Socrates holds a book. They are gathered in a large meeting space. Pythagoras is there. He has a set of scales that he's using. If you remember, Pythagoras is the one responsible for the Pythagorean theorem, that a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And of course, like most of the high Renaissance masters, the Raphael is likening humanity with math as much as possible. In the lower right-hand corner is a philosopher named Hercules. Hercules was a philosopher, but the head of Hercules was taken from a portrait of Michelangelo. And on the right, students congregate around Euclid. Euclid was responsible for mathematical theorems. And then just right of Euclid, we see Zoroaster. In that area, we see a self-portrait of Raphael. And so he's likening the artists to being geniuses, just like the philosophers of his time. So what you're looking here is a cartoon for a tapestry that portrays Christ's charge to St. Peter. That's Christ telling Peter to follow him. The It was originally painted on paper, but now it's been transferred to canvas. A cartoon is a work of art that was a preparatory, we want to call it a sketch, but it was really a preparatory painting for a weaving or a tapestry. So what you're looking at is the cartoon for that tapestry. Um, just a word about the tapestries. For centuries, tapestries were only unrolled for display in the Sistine Chapel on special occasions. And so because of that and their age, some of the colors that we see presented have been altered a bit from the cartoon to the tapestry. But typically, the cartoons are more sculptural in effect because they're based on a drawing. The tapestries tend to feel a little bit more painterly because they're woven. In the tapestry that was created from this cartoon, there were metallic threads that were used to create a sense of depth in the surface and a sense of brilliance. Which in turn reminded the viewer of the flatness of the picture plane. So you get a lot of depth within the cartoon, but then when you look at the actual tapestry, it sort of translates differently, and I'll show you that when I show you the tapestry here in a moment. The tapestries were all woven in Brussels by Flemish weavers, and of course they didn't stay true completely to Raphael's design. They changed the color of St. Peter's eyes, and they changed the color of St. Peter's robe from gold and blue to red and blue. And originally Christ wore a simple white robe like you see here, and they change it to a starburst robe in the tapestry. Let's look at that tapestry. So here's the tapestry. You can clearly see that St. Peter is now kneeling and is receiving a charge from Jesus. And of course, his garment has been changed from the yellow and blue, or the gold and blue, to red and blue. And then you can see Jesus's garment now has this starburst pattern all over it, when originally he wore just a simple plain white garment. You can also see the difference between the tapestry's painterly feel and the drawing that you saw, which was very sculptural. It had a sense of weightiness to it. I think this just comes from the inherent differences in medium. It's a little bit difficult to get a good sense of value variation transferred over to an image like this.